These are the three main types of camera lens filters, and this is why you might actually need each of them. First up, we have the UV filter, and this one stirs up quite a bit of controversy amongst photographers. The UV filter originates back to film photography days. Film is a lot more sensitive to UV or ultraviolet light, and what happened with film photography is that you would end up with a bluish color cast on your images if you didn't use a UV filter. Fast forward to today, and with digital cameras, you really can't see a difference between shooting with the UV filter versus not shooting with one. But, and this is where a lot of the controversy comes in amongst photographers, a lot of photographers like to use a UV filter still to protect the front of their lenses from getting scratched. You might think, well, that makes sense. UV filters are cheap and lenses are expensive, and if they really don't affect the image quality, then all is good, right? But then you have other photographers that say, but wait, why would you put a cheap piece of glass in front of an expensive piece of glass? Honestly, I could care less. I don't really take a side in this. If you want to use a UV filter, then use one. If you don't, then don't. For the longest time, I didn't use a UV filter on any of my lenses. But recently, and I don't know if you could see this, but I scratched my lens. I know, it's heartbreaking. I'm not sure exactly what scratched the lens, but it got scratched nonetheless. So now I'm using a UV filter on some of my other lenses so that the same thing doesn't happen. Anyway, go ahead and buy one if you're worried about scratching your lens. Test it out with some photos and some videos and see if you notice a difference. Next up, we have the CP filter, or the circular polarizing filter. And what these things will do is get rid of reflections in your images, which is great if you're shooting things like cars or if you want to shoot through water. They can also reduce glare and reflections off skin tones. The way they work is by not allowing light from a certain direction through the filter, which is why to get them to work, you need to turn the glass element on the front of the filter. This in turn allows you to dictate how much of that light you're blocking from entering your lens. Where you might also use a CP filter is on a sunny or a hazy day. And what it'll do here is it'll reduce the glare a little bit and increase the amount of contrast in your photos. Last up, we have the variable ND filter, or the neutral density filter. You can kind of think of an ND filter like sunglasses for your lens. They work by restricting the overall amount of light that enters your lens, thus resulting in a darker image. Where you'll need an ND filter is in situations which you can't adjust your camera settings any further to restrict the amount of light coming into your lens. A common use case of an ND filter is when you're shooting outdoor video. Typically, when you're shooting videos, you're trying to maintain something called the 180-degree shutter rule. Essentially what this means is that your shutter speed should be set to double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed will be set at 1/50. Now, this is fine if you're shooting inside, but if you're shooting outside in the middle of the day, this will result in your images being way overexposed. Now, because there's a limit to how low your ISO can go, there's really no other camera setting that you can change to restrict the amount of light that's coming into your lens. So you use an ND filter to take your image, which would otherwise look like this, to make it look like this. Another common use case for an ND filter is when you're doing long exposure photography to shoot things like flowing water. In order to get this effect in your images where the water looks really smooth and creamy, you need to lower the shutter speed pretty slow. Because your shutter speed is so slow and your aperture is probably locked in, again, you can't lower your ISO low enough to be able to get a proper exposure without using an ND filter. When it comes to ND filters, there's two types that you can buy. You can buy a fixed ND filter where the sunglass strength, so to speak, is fixed at a certain amount. Then you have a variable ND filter in which you can adjust the strength of the sunglasses by just turning the front face of the filter. This is my preferred version of the ND filter, just because you have so much more flexibility for whatever lighting condition you're in to change that exposure to whatever you need it to be. There are a ton of different filter brands out there, some of which are really expensive and some of which are really cheap. Now, I've used a few of them, but the ones that I've been using lately that I really like are the JJC filters. The filter that I use the most is the JJC variable ND filter, and the one that I have is an 82mm filter. Just a quick tip for buying filters. Rather than buying a filter for each one of your lenses, for each of the different sizes of the lens, pick the lens that you have with the biggest thread size. For example, this Sigma 24-70 has an 82mm thread. Rather than buying a 72mm filter and an 82mm filter, I just bought the 182mm filter. Then you can buy what are called step-up rings, which look like this, and they step up your smaller thread size to fit your bigger filters. All right, so those are the main 3 lens filters that you might actually use day to day. There are other filters that you can buy, like the gold morphic or the blue morphic filters from Polar Pro, that add more of a stylistic touch to your images. There are tons of different stylistic filters that you can buy. Personally, I don't use them. I've just never felt the desire to buy these filters to get a specific look in my images when I can just edit the image to look the way I want afterwards. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If it is, and you want to keep seeing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on my next video. I'll see you guys in the next one.